Welcome to the Diverse Minds podcast, where we give you the tips, tools and techniques you need to be a mentally healthy and inclusive leader. Each week, you'll hear about a variety of topics linked to mental health, well-being and diversity that will enhance both your professional practice and personal well-being. Welcome to the 47th episode of the Diverse Minds podcast. On today's episode, I'm going to be talking about culture and leadership. And I wanted to talk about this as I've been delivering leadership programs for Black, global majority and staff of colour for several years, and talking about and thinking about culture is a key theme to these programs. I also think the coronavirus pandemic has shone a light on varying different styles of quote-unquote leadership based on cultural country frameworks, and how this in many cases hasn't worked well, or it's been a game changer and saved thousands of lives. When I use the word culture, I'm not using it as a proxy for race. Race is in fact about systems, hierarchy, and privileges based on assumptions. Culture, ethnicity, and race are often used interchangeably. But culture is a system of beliefs that links to identity, and that identity may or may not be linked to race for an individual, but often culture and race are interlinked. And ethnicity is often viewed as a mixture of both race and culture in a way that we self-identify. But unfortunately, that word can be used in quite a toxic way. So what is culture? How do you define culture? What do you think of when you hear the word culture? Well, according to the Oxford Dictionary in 2017, culture is the ideas, customs, and social behaviour of a particular people or society. But I think it's much more than that. It's a framework, background, circumstances in which people live and communicate, or even an event takes place. Culture is a really complex system of traits, morals, customs shared by a particular group of people, and it's also a way of creating, sending, storing and processing information. And I think that's come to the fore recently, as we've seen with the falling statues or lack of falling statues around key people in history who have been slave owners and who have done horrific things to Black communities, and how those cultures have created a system for creating, sending, storing and processing information about them, and how now that culture might be shifting through the medium of toppling the statues. So it's interesting, and culture is not stagnant. It shifts, it changes with time. Not necessarily always to a huge degree, but there will always be shifts and changes in culture. And culture comprises of attitudes of people, beliefs, languages are a really big part of culture, customs, rituals, faith and religion can feed into culture, food, art, drama, music, and several other aspects. But these are some of the headline things. And of course, culture influences our behaviour and actions that we take. So I'd like to ask you, and you might want to pause the podcast here, but how you define your personal culture. And this is a really interesting question, because in the UK, where we have majority culture, let's say in England actually, a majority culture of white English people, often people really struggle to do this, because sometimes it's only when we step out of our culture that we really realise what it is. And day to day, if we're in a majority culture and we fit into that majority, it can be difficult to define our culture. But those of us who aren't in a majority culture, it can be easier to consider this. Not always. But what about your family's diaspora journey? Do you think about national identity? Do you think about your interests, hobbies and passions? What really defines your personal culture, and what does that mean to you? And of course, in every culture, there'll be facets that are visible and facets that are non-visible. So if we take an example of an iceberg, and you might have done this in training sessions with lots of different themes, there's the iceberg of dyslexia, there are all sorts of icebergs. But if you think you've got the tip of the iceberg above the water, you've got the waterline, and then you've got things below the waterline. And above the waterline are things that we can see. So behaviours, visible behaviours, and results. So the outcomes as a result of those behaviours. And on the waterline, there'll be things that kind of flow between observable and invisible. And under the waterline are beliefs and values. You can't necessarily see them always. Thinking, what people think, and emotions. Now, emotions are an interesting one because, again, it depends on your culture. For certain cultures, emotions are very much above the waterline. They're observable because people communicate them. They shout, they yell, they smile, they laugh, they cry quite publicly. But in other cultures, that will be below the waterline. So it's important to think about these things. And of course, we'll have individual cultures, family cultures, regional cultures, country cultures, and let's not forget organizational cultures. And organizational cultures are a myriad of things, really. So you've got the vision, mission, and values of an organization, and they're often quite obvious and easy to access. So they'll be on a website, they'll be on a company's website as you normally log on. They'll be on materials, so annual reports. They'll be on adverts if someone advertises, on job adverts, anything at all. And they're quite easily found. But then when you step into an organization, there are other things that are kind of hidden. So control systems. So there might be obvious control systems, especially if it's related to health and safety or practical things or legal requirements. But really also, what are the kinds of control taking place? Who controls what and how do they control things? There's organizational structure. So what's on an organogram? But again, who creates that organogram? So who has the power to do that? And tied into that, we've got power structures. So again, power structures in relation to who does what job, who's senior, who's middle ranking, who's junior. And I know a lot of organizations have flat organizational structures, but the power lies with someone. And it doesn't necessarily have to be in a negative way. It could be knowledge power. It could be referent power. It could be power in relation to authority, power in relation to systems. It's lots of different things. But of course, that will feed a culture, or who's allowed to have power. Also, there'll be symbols. So every organization has a logo. And what does that logo mean? Or what is the logo trying to communicate? And what does it actually communicate? So that's interesting. And even if the symbol is the company's name written in a particular font or a particular way. The rituals and routines. So this might have changed recently, but I suppose we could think about it in terms of which social platforms people are using, which online platforms people are using for meetings. Do people come on time? Do people come 5 minutes before a meeting? What happens in the kitchen or what happens in a virtual kitchen? If people are meeting up for coffee meetings, all these rituals and routines. When is the annual party? Why is there an annual party? What is the annual party like? What's the venue for the annual party? Anything at all like that. And then there's stories and myths. So again, if it's a big organization, different departments, there might be stories and myths about that organization and different stories that are told internally to the stories and myths that might be heard and received externally. So it's also important to consider how our own culture, however we define that, fits into an organizational culture, one that we're working in. And this is often where we can get discord. So we've seen this quite a lot in politics, where we have an overall leader of a country not really reflecting necessarily a majority of the citizens in a country. So some citizens will be represented, and how then there's a complete mismatch of vision, mission, and values, and the kind of power structure and the stories and myths that the citizens hear, or that they know, or we look to the past, or our own culture and how our leader fits our vision of our own cultural vision of what a leader should be. So what about culture and leadership then? People often feel that leadership is for a select group of people, that it's small, that it's finite, that it's ring fence, that you're born a leader, or that people don't have access to it, or you need the right job title. But actually, don't forget that we're all leaders in our own right. And if any of you have read the Robin Sharma book, Lead Without a Title, it is an interesting aspect to how we are all leaders in our own right. And I do subscribe to that. I do think we lead our own lives. I know many people who are parents talk about their biggest leadership role being parenthood. So it's important to apply new thinking and really think about cultural capital. So what is cultural capital? And I particularly want to focus here on global majority, people of colour, black staff, or black people who run their own businesses as well. And according to Tara J. Yosso, in 2005, she wrote a paper, and it was focused in America, and it was about communities of colour was her term. And she talks about community cultural wealth is an array of knowledge, skills, abilities, and contacts possessed and utilised by communities of colour to survive and resist macro and micro forms of oppression. So right from the get-go, when we enter the school playground, or perhaps even before that, those of us who belong to communities of colour are developing cultural capital, and we're having to use leadership skills to navigate our way around and within majority culture environments. And in this paper, Tara J. Yosso talks about 6 areas that she's researched in relation to leadership and culture. So that there's community cultural wealth. The first area is aspirational. So aspirational is all about maintaining the hopes and dreams and possibilities of a child or a young person achieving their dreams despite discrimination and barriers. And they could be mental barriers. So it's really about blitzing those mental barriers and saying you can be what you want. There is an aspiration here that we're not giving up, and that is not one negative destiny for particular communities of colour. The second one is familial, and familial isn't not necessarily just about your family, but it's about that extended community, or as she puts it in the paper, kin. The history, emotional and moral compass that an extended familial contacts give us, so that isolation's minimized. So if you live in a community of colour, that could be through religious establishments, that could be through community volunteering, community activism, that could be through friends, Saturday schools, that there's a familial cultural capital within this, and how people within communities of culture help each other through these networks. And the third one is social capital. So these are the genuine bonds. So it builds on familial. The social capital, the genuine bonds and connections that hold people together. And that also provide a support network when things get really difficult. So you have people to draw on. The fourth area is navigational. So these are all about survival strategies in hostile environments. So the individual agency that people have despite constraints. And I often refer to a book that illustrates this really well, which is called Templed Radicals by Deborah Meyerson. She talks about this sort of navigational survival strategies. It's focused on African American people in the workplace, women and LGBT communities in the workplace in America. It's about, I think, 10 or 12 years old. But some of the survival strategies that she mentions in there around pushing back when people ask African American staff to wear their hair in a particular way. So what are the survival strategies that people have? Or when people, their constant microaggressions, kind of navigating that. The fifth area is resistance or being resistant. So this is oppositional behavior that pushes back against inequity. And often we can and will scream in silence, but it's when to know how to do that and how to do that. So what are the resistant mechanisms that also enable us as communities of colour to get to where we need to be? And the final one is linguistic. So this might be speaking other languages, but more than that, it's about styles of speech, intellectual intuition about storytelling, oral traditions, and also reading other people's language as an innate skill. So when we think about our own culture, particularly if we're from global majority Black or communities of culture, according to Tara J. Yosso, these are the 6 areas, and they really resonate with me. So I don't know how this sits with you or what you think, and I'll also include a link to the paper in the show notes. And these areas may or may not help us to decide how we or who we want to work for and how those organisations sit with us. But it's also important to remember that everyone has culture. So if you're not from a community of colour, this might not resonate with you in the same way. However, you will have a culture, and certain organisational cultures will suit you more than others, particularly if we think about the gendered workplaces or macho toxic masculine culture. And how that may or may not work for you in a particular way. And again, the important thing here is to recognize that everyone has a different cultural framework. And so for some people who want to move into leadership, their perspective on leadership may not match or resonate your perspective on leadership, which may come from a completely westernized perspective. So often when I work with Asian leaders or aspiring leaders, I find that they talk a lot about being introvert and not speaking, because in many Asian cultures, whether it's South Asian, Southeast Asian or Far East Asian, talking too much is not a good thing. It's about being silent, about taking in everyone's thoughts, about listening and then acting. Whereas often, particularly in North American cultures, this is seen as being weak or not making a decision quickly enough. Well, this is completely opposite in different areas. So it's important to be cognizant. And I just wanted to mention, that's just one example. And I just wanted to mention something called high and low context cultures. And this is incredibly broad brushstroke, and it's based on the work of Edward T. Hall. But what we find is that Anglo countries, so North America, Canada, Australia, the UK, New Zealand, and Nordic countries as well. So Germany, Switzerland, Swiss German areas. And I'm just doing a very broad brushstroke, are what are considered low context cultures. So this is where things are more logical, they're more linear, individualistic, so it's very much around the individual, and the individual has a relationship with the government, with the state, with other individuals. It's very action orientated around which actions you're going to take. Lives are very compartmentalized, and language is often precise and just enough to get the message across. And that's where it's interesting that generally the UK falls into this category, but I think English, UK English is not very precise. It is very coded. So again, please note that I am talking about this in broad brushstrokes. There are sliding scales, and you can also be low context in certain situations and high context in others. And then, as I mentioned, high context. So these will be more the cultures in, so Arab cultures, I would say most African cultures, even though I know it's a huge continent, I am saying most African cultures are much more relational. So they would fall into this. India, Southeast, Far East, South American cultures. It's much more relational. So it's much more about the individual and having that, relation with people. It's collectivist. So that whole idea of I am because we are, you are because I am. It's intuitive. It can be really from the gut. It's more contemplative than action orientated. That's not to say that people from these backgrounds don't take action, but it's that point I made about contemplating, getting people's views, doing right by the collective. And it's much more oral. Information is transmitted orally rather than written traditionally. And there is lots written about this. So if you're interested, I would say have a look at Edward T. Hall's work, but also you might like to look at the work of the Hofstede Institute and Trompenaars, who do work in culture. But all three are from a Western male lens. So that needs to be taken in perspective as well. But I think helpful to think about different cultures. So with coronavirus, we've seen different reactions to this. And again, if we could just get people to think about how to do things differently, it could have saved lives. And it is also in the workplace extremely helpful. So I think in order to understand values or know how to shift things and move towards positive change in organisations, we need to understand our own culture, the organisational's culture, and that of others. And if we really care about diversity and inclusion, we need to start talking and thinking about culture, ethnicity, and race. And if you want to know more about how I can help you with this area of work, please don't forget that I am offering free 30-minute calls to help you. So by talking and understanding the links between culture, ethnicity, and race, it does actually make it easier and more comfortable to understand your own culture, that of the organisation, and also to pinpoint any blind spots there might be that you might have individually as a team, but also collectively as an organisation. Boards need to be talking about this. It's absolutely vital. So culture is crucial. It's important. It defines who we are, where we fit in, and how we can help ourselves, and in what ways we like to help ourselves, and our go-to methods and modes. Our own cultural values help shape who we are and how we lead. And we may not be cognizant of this. So to take a step back and understand how we lead and how our culture has shaped that is also a really important part of this journey. We need to all see things through other cultural lenses. And the other point to mention here is just because people might be from a similar cultural background related to national identity and race, they are going to have different perspectives because there's always plurality. Plurality is the name of the game, and you know I talk about this a lot. So in order to reduce cultural or communication misunderstandings, if we can talk about our culture and our standpoint and our frame of reference and where we're coming from, this helps reduce conflict immensely. And Black, global majority, people of colour have so much cultural capital to bring to the table. So if there's a group you identify with, don't underestimate your power, especially now. And for those of you who aren't from these backgrounds, don't overlook this staff group's power because they have a lot and they can help you with your customers and clients. And so by talking about it, you're actually enabling your organisation to grow. So I really hope you found this episode useful, and I love talking about culture. So please get in touch with me if you want to book a free 30-minute call to find out how we can work together. And you can do this by going on my Calendly, which is Calendly, calendly.com/LolaO. And thank you so much for listening today, and I really look forward to seeing you in the next episode.
Thanks for listening to the Diverse Minds podcast. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you access your podcasts from. You can also connect with me on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Tune into next week's episode of the podcast, where I'll bring you more insights on mental health and inclusion. Bye for now.